Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast designed to help you become the leader you are destined to be. Today's episode is all about boundaries. And this thought and this concept came from, I'm working on a new book. I'm actually working on a book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, specifically for personal growth and transformation for women. And I've got the rough draft done, and we're in kind of the final stages of editing. And one of the chapters in here is dedicated to boundaries. Now, the book's not out yet. It is available for pre-order, but you can't get the book yet, even though you can pre-order it. It's not actually published yet. And I wanted to do an episode on this chapter because I think it's so powerful for us when we understand how boundaries can really help us and be an incredible valuable tool for us, both personally and professionally. So I wanted to just dig into the concept from this chapter and share some of these thoughts with you. So first off, a boundary is something that it really just defines one area from another. It could be a real wall or a fence, something like that, but it also could just be imaginary, right? Something that we imagine and create in our lives. It's not really a tangible fence or boundary or wall or something like that. It's just a border between two areas. So personal boundaries are the limits that we set and create for ourselves. Relational boundaries are the limits that we create and set with respect to others. So there's two key differences there. So let's talk about personal boundaries first. A personal boundary is something that we determine by our values. It's kind of the acceptable limits, is the way I like to think of it, of which we make our choices. So for example, I've probably talked about this before. I love ice cream. Like, ice cream is just, it's just such a treat for me. And I love different flavors. In fact, I love all the flavors: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. I think there are like 3 different kinds of ice cream in the freezer right now. And I love them with, nuts on top and chocolate syrup, or I love just ice cream plain, or, on top of apple pie. Like, ice cream is just one of my favorite treats. But because I value my health, one of the boundaries that I set for myself is just limiting how often I enjoy ice cream. I've decided for myself that a little ice cream is okay. It's a treat, it's an indulgence. I enjoy it when I indulge in it, but eating ice cream every day would not serve me and becoming the best version of myself, right? So it's a personal boundary that I've set for myself of within this boundary, I can choose to have my ice cream. I've said this before, we always can make our choices, but we don't get to choose whether we get the consequences of those choices, right? That's just the natural law, is if you make a choice, you also are choosing to receive those consequences. I've heard the analogy that you cannot pick up one side of a coin without getting the other side as well, right? I mean, if you pick up the coin, you're going to get both sides of it. And on one side is our choice, and the other side are the consequences that come with it. And it's just a natural principle. It's just something we have to learn to navigate. The power is in realizing that as we make those choices, if we make the choices with consideration to the consequences, we can learn to choose much more effectively in our life. So for me, I've chosen a boundary for myself that I'm like, you know what, it's about once or maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, I treat myself to a bowl of ice cream. That's just the boundary that I set. And perhaps I even enjoy it a little bit more because I don't get it every day, right? I just save that as a treat or something like that. And the difference is, it's not that I want it and can't have it. I mean, it's in the freezer. I could just get up and go get it. It's that I can have it, but I'm choosing not to. I'm choosing not to eat ice cream for breakfast every day because I don't want the natural consequences that come with it. I mean, if I ate ice cream for breakfast every day, pretty soon I'd need to be shopping for a bigger wardrobe. So, thinking through your personal values helps you set your personal boundaries. And that's a good thing. Perhaps you have a treat that you want to just limit how much you enjoy it, right? And that's a good thing. That's a good personal boundary. But I can't tell you what that boundary is or what personal boundaries you should adopt. That's a personal decision. Right? We all make those choices and decisions based on our boundaries, our values. And I'm just encouraging you to think through what those boundaries and values are for you personally. But I'd also like to think about what are the relational boundaries that maybe you would like to put in place or like to define more clearly in your life. And this could be for personal relationships, it could be for professional relationships, it could be a relationship with your job. So for example, you might particularly with all the technology these days, you probably have access to your email all of the time. I mean, that's just the way of it, is that everywhere we go these days, we have a phone and we have constant access to our emails, including emails from work, right? They're always there. And I can remember, I mean, it's been several years ago, but back when I was working in a job that had, a real job, as some people would say, but back when I was working in the hospital environment, my emails came to my phone, and so it was just so easy to get caught up into checking those regularly. It's very easy to do, even if you're at home, even if it was nighttime or the weekends. In fact, it wasn't unusual to get an email from my boss after hours, late, or even on the weekend, because she was checking her emails and working on the weekends too sometimes. And so, that's just the nature of being accessible these days and all the technology. But perhaps you've realized that that's taking over a lot of your personal time. And maybe you want to set a boundary that says, hey, I only check email from this time of day to this time of day. Or on Sundays, I don't check work email or something like that. That's just an example. But you could set a boundary like that. I have a personal, well, it's personal and professional boundary for me, that I don't like to check my phone first thing in the morning. And what I mean by that is I check to make sure, if I've missed any calls or something like that that's urgent, but I don't like to just jump on to social media and email first thing in the morning. I like to take the first few minutes of my day and set the tone for my day before I dive into the constant social media and responding to comments and posting and things like that. That's just one of my personal and professional boundaries. It's just a way that I've set a limit on how that affects the first few minutes of my day. I find my mindset is just so much better for the rest of the day if I have those first few minutes intentionally not getting, sucked into social media and emails and things like that. So, there again, just an example of how a boundary can be used effectively. But what boundaries should we have, or do we want to have, in our relationships with other people? And sometimes we think about that, sometimes we don't, but a lot of times we have relationships in our life, and they may not be necessarily toxic. They may not be absolutely just terrible relationships. I think we all intuitively know that we need to get rid of those toxic relationships. And I did a podcast episode on that last year. So if that's interesting, or if that's something you really are struggling with, then go back and listen to that podcast episode where I really talk about toxic relationships. But some relationships aren't necessarily toxic. They're just not great relationships. And what I mean by that is maybe we need to set a boundary on those type of relationships and just limit how much time we spend in those relationships or with that person. It doesn't mean that they're a bad person, certainly not. It doesn't mean that we're better than anybody else. It just means intentionally thinking about the relationships that maybe they're not toxic and you really hadn't thought, oh, I don't need to spend time with that person at all. But maybe that relationship just isn't helping you grow. Maybe it's just not helping you be the best version of yourself. Maybe it's not really pulling you down much, or maybe you haven't stopped to think about maybe it really is. See, the thing about it is if it's a relationship that isn't downright toxic, so maybe we permit a little more time in that relationship, or maybe we allow a little more time in that relationship. But if it's not positively adding value to us in some way and helping us grow, then it is pulling us down, because it's limiting the time and energy that we have for relationships that do help us grow. And that's the important thing, is sometimes if it's not downright toxic, we think, it's not that bad. But even if it doesn't seem like that, it's that bad or that bad of a relationship, it might be pulling you down simply by the fact that it's preventing you from having more time and energy for the best relationships, or the best influences on you. And I really had not thought about boundaries in relationships in that way. I've talked about boundaries for toxic relationships before, as I mentioned, but I really hadn't stopped to think about relational boundaries are also something that we should consider for those relationships that maybe just aren't, maybe lukewarm. Maybe they're lukewarm. They're not downright hot or downright cold. They're just lukewarm. And so we tolerate those because they're not hot or cold. They're just lukewarm. And yet, think about the cost of what it's holding us back from. So, the thing is, it's tough for us to enforce boundaries sometimes. I think as women especially, sometimes we feel like we don't want to tell other people no, or we don't want to set boundaries in relationships, and because we love people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we don't in fact enforce and value our boundaries, no one else will either. So an example of a lukewarm relationship that maybe isn't downright toxic, but isn't good either. And I use this analogy in the book. So let's say you have a friend who sets a date for lunch with you, but you go to the restaurant and then she never shows up. And the next day she calls you and says, "Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I forgot about our lunch date." And so you forgive her and you reschedule. But as you arrive at the restaurant, the next time you reschedule, she sends a text message and says, "Oh, something came up. I can't make it. Sorry." And like literally you're pulling into the parking lot of the restaurant. And you say, "Okay, I'll forgive you. Something came up. That's understandable." So you reschedule again with similar results a third time. And maybe this time she's just 20 minutes late, right? And you shouldn't be mad at this friend because she's already revealed what kind of person she is. She doesn't value your time and commitments the same way that you do. And so, you absolutely can continue to forgive her and reschedule and forgive her, reschedule. But if you do, you can't get mad when she continually stands you up or reschedules or is late, because she's already said, "Hey, this is who I am." And so she's revealed that to you. So just think about that. You certainly can allow that relationship, or you could just define a boundary and say, have an honest discussion with that person and say, "Look, I value my time obviously different than you value your time, and that's okay. But let's stop making commitments to meet for lunch that we're not going to be able to keep." And, it's okay to have that conversation. And that would be an example of a boundary on a lukewarm relationship. I mean, the friend isn't a bad person because she doesn't value time the same way you do. It's just you have different values. So it's not necessarily toxic, right? But it certainly is taking your time and energy to keep rescheduling for lunch dates that you don't end up in, being able to keep. So thinking about that, what relationship boundaries would you want to set? Are there other relationships? Maybe they're not friends, maybe they're family members. Sometimes it's unfortunate, but the people that love us, our family members, and should care for us the most, can sometimes be the most negative influences in our life. And it's difficult to set boundaries on those relationships because they are family and we do care about them and we love them. But sometimes it's really healthy to think through, do I need to set better boundaries on these relationships? And it really, again, it comes down to choosing what's best for us and what's helping us become the best version of ourselves. I generally turn my phone to do not disturb after about 7 o'clock and maybe 8 o'clock at night some nights. And because at some point I need to turn off my brain and my mind. I don't want to constantly be on the phone and, receiving emails, and it's distracting, and I find that I don't sleep as good if I'm on the phone, responding to messages and emails and that kind of thing late. And so for me, I figured out what works really good is to just set that to do not disturb. And then if I want to, I can, check it, or if I'm expecting something, I can check in, but it's not constantly interrupting the peace of my evening. And so it's just a boundary that I've set for myself. So think through that. And maybe this is it's certainly not something you can do just right off the cuff, although there may be some relationships in your life that as you listen to this, you're thinking, yeah, I really do need to establish some boundaries in that relationship. If that has come to mind already, if there's a particular relationship that you're like, wow, I do need to set a boundary in that relationship, then that's a red flag, right? That might be one you want to give a little more attention to. But, maybe this is a take a walk and just think through intentionally the relationships that you have in your life with your friends, with your family, with the people you work with even, and just thinking about, do you need to restructure any of those relationships? It needs to be a win-win, right? Both people should benefit from a relationship. It should be mutually beneficial where both people are adding value to each other. Otherwise, it's a win-lose relationship. And I want you to know those can be toxic in their own way. Even if you're the one who's benefiting, if you're not also adding value in some way, then that's not a formula for a long-term successful relationship. So think through that. And I would encourage you, there again, slow down for a few minutes, go for a walk, or maybe in your quiet time, and just think through the relationships in your life, and are they mutually beneficial? Are both people adding value in that relationship? Is it bringing both of you up? And a lot of times when we actually stop to slow down and intentionally think through these questions, we find that, some small tweaks could really help us. Because there again, if we decrease the amount of time we spend in relationships that are lukewarm or pulling us down or downright toxic, if we decrease the time and energy that goes into those relationships, we have more time and energy for relationships that build us up. And that's important because that's what really helps us take a step towards our potential, right? And there again, it's not because we are better than anyone. It's just that we are going somewhere intentionally in life. I know you are. You wouldn't be listening to a personal growth podcast if you didn't have goals and dreams for yourself and want to be moving intentionally in a direction of life. And I know this about you. I know you are growth oriented. And so I just want to encourage you that this is a way that it's been helpful for me to learn how to think about relationship boundaries and which ones were maybe not bad in and of themselves, but maybe they weren't helping me grow. And so just recognizing that and being intentional with the time and the effort and the energy that I dedicate toward those relationships. And could I be using it somewhere else? So just a thought. Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.